all of us make moral judgments and think about moral questions. So sometimes that might be because you're presented with a difficult situation or a tempting situation. So you might be tempted to lie to a colleague to avoid an embarrassing situation. You might be tempted to betray someone's trust. You might be tempted to cheat on a partner. And in that kind of case, you might ask yourself, well, is this really okay for me to do this thing? In other sorts of cases, we think about moral questions which don't kind of bear so directly on our immediate action. So you might ask yourself whether or not the US was justified in going to war, the US and its allies were justified in going to war in Iraq. You might ask yourself whether or not what rich countries should be doing to help relieve global poverty. You might ask yourself what we should all be doing about climate change. So these are all examples of moral questions. To say that morality is objective is to say that questions like these have correct answers. So if you like, there are facts about what's right and wrong, and that these facts hold independently of what we or our society happen to think about them. So in this talk I sort of want to do two things. So the first thing I want to do is suggest that very often people treat moral questions as if they're objective. And then I want to raise two reasons why we might be suspicious of that, why we might think actually moral questions don't have correct answers. And here my aim will really just be to kind of raise some issues for discussion. I'll kind of say a few things, but I certainly won't settle any issues. So to start off with, my first thing is to say a little bit about why I think we typically treat morality as if it's objective. So I think this kind of reveals itself in about at least four ways. So first of all, if you're faced with a difficult moral dilemma, you'll often think long and hard about it. You'll deliberate a long time about it. You might indeed kind of agonize over it. You might seek out advice from friends or family. You might look for help from a religious or a philosophical text, or maybe from a work of literature. It's not clear why you do this if you didn't think that the moral question you were trying to answer had a correct answer. Secondly, we treat moral questions as questions for debate and discussion. So if you discover that someone you respect disagrees with you about some moral question, so you discover that someone, suppose you think that eating meat is perfectly fine, and someone you respect thinks that eating meat is impermissible, then you're likely to want to know why this person thinks that eating meat is impermissible. So you want to know their reasons for thinking that, and you might engage them in discussion and debate about this with a view towards resolving your disagreement. Again, this practice sort of seems to presuppose that one of you is right and the other is wrong about whether or not eating meat is permissible. Thirdly, when we consider a moral question, we often kind of want to seek out further information. So if you're, to stick with the same example, if you're wondering whether or not eating meat is permissible, you'll often want to find out as much as you can about how animals are treated, about how farming, the meat industry works, about options for eating healthily without eating meat, and so on. And again, it's not clear what would be the point of doing those things if you didn't think there was something to be discovered, if you didn't think there was an answer to the question of, well, is it okay to eat meat? Fourthly, we don't, I think, typically take moral questions to be settled by what we or our society think about them. So to continue with that same example, I might know very well that I'm in a society in which everyone thinks eating meat is just fine, but still ask myself, well, but is it really okay to eat meat? I recognise the possibility that my society thinks that eating meat is okay, but actually they're mistaken about that. To give another kind of example, I might live in a society in which slavery is taken to be okay. It seems like I can intelligibly ask, well, but is it really okay? So I've said that these are kind of four ways in which it seems as if we typically treat morality as if it was objective, as if moral questions had correct answers independently of what we of our society think. And it might be kind of helpful here to just kind of contrast the way in which we treat moral questions with the way in which we treat questions about matters of taste or about etiquette. So consider matters of taste. Suppose that I like vanilla ice cream and you like strawberry ice cream. We might just take that to be an interesting difference between us, but we won't take it to be a kind of matter for discussion or debate. We won't kind of seek out further information to try and find out which is really the best kind of ice cream. We'll just say, it's just we're just different in this way. I like one kind of ice cream, you like another kind of ice cream. It seems like questions about kind of what's the best kind of ice cream are kind of not objective. They're, if you like, subjective. Secondly, think about kind of matters of etiquette. You might think there are correct answers to the question of kind of, well, is a certain kind of action polite? But those answers seem to be settled by basically what people in a society think, right? So if enough people in the society think that it's polite to shake people's hands when you're meeting them, then it is polite to shake people's hands when you introduce them. That's just kind of what it is for the rule of etiquette to apply. But if what I've suggested so far is right, it seems like we don't treat morality in these ways. We don't treat it to just be we don't treat it as if it's just settled by what everyone thinks, or by what we kind of happen to feel about it at the moment. It seems like we treat morality more like domains like history or mathematics. So we take historical and mathematical questions have right and wrong answers. These right and wrong answers are not settled by what someone happens to think about them or what we happen to think about them. It's easy to imagine societies with very often widely mistaken beliefs about historical and mathematical questions. And it seems like we treat morality, typically a lot of people treat morality in something like the same way. However, lots of people have thought that this, although we tend to treat morality in this way, we're kind of wrong to do so. That there's some kind of illusion here. They've thought that, people often kind of presuppose or treat morality as if it's objective, but it can't really be. You find this idea in philosophy, you find it in literature, you find it in popular culture. So just to take one example, one famous example, so Shakespeare has Hamlet say that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. The idea here seems to be, well, kind of when you get down to it, nothing is really good or bad. It's just, it's just what we think about what's good or bad. It's what we think about what's good or bad which makes things kind of good or bad. And so that on that kind of view, morality does look more like a matter of taste, like in the ice cream case, or maybe more like etiquette, something which is kind of settled by what people in our society think. So why might someone accept that sort of view? Why might we be tempted by that kind of view? Well, I think there are several sorts of reasons. But I think, but here what I want to talk about are just two kinds of reasons which I think are particularly powerful or influential. So first off, lots of people are struck by the amount of disagreement over moral questions. So if we look back through history, we find cultures and societies with kind of radically different moral views to our own. So we find societies who accept the permissibility of slavery. We find societies who think that combat between gladiators, that is to say, fights to the death between slaves, is an acceptable form of popular entertainment. We find societies who have accepted forms of infanticide or cannibalism. And of course we don't have to look very far to find societies who thought that, well, only certain kinds of people have the right to political participation. Those examples are examples of kind of intercultural, perhaps, or disagreement over time or between cultures. But of course there are also deep disagreements within cultures, right? I mean, even within modern Western societies, there are deep disagreements about when, if ever, abortion and euthanasia are permissible, when it's permissible to go to war, when, if ever, torture is permissible, and what we should be doing about climate change, whether it's okay to eat meat, all these sorts of questions. Even within kind of modern Western societies, there's lots of disagreement on these matters. And so these kind of observations, noticing these kind of things, makes, I think, a lot of people uneasy about morality. They kind of think, well, if morality was objective, why would there be so much disagreement on these moral questions? So I want to pursue that line of thought a little bit. Why might we think that this range of moral disagreement should make us think that morality isn't really objective? Well, so to begin with, note that disagreement isn't in and of itself a reason to think that disagreement on a question isn't in and of itself a reason to think that that question doesn't have a correct answer. After all, people being what they are, they can disagree about just about anything. I mean, there are lots of people who still think that the Earth, well, there are some people who still think the Earth is flat. There are lots of people who still deny that humans evolved by natural selection. So the mere fact of disagreement on a question shouldn't lead us to think, oh, that question doesn't have a correct answer. What would be more worrying, I think, is if there are cases of rational disagreement on a question. Let's say disagreement on a question in which both parties to the disagreement seem entirely rational. Both parties to the disagreement seem to have thought about all of the arguments and evidence on each side. Both parties to this disagreement seem to be aware of all of the relevant facts. If there are cases like that, then you might start to think, well, okay, these people all have the same information, they're both being rational, they both thought about the same arguments. Why do they still disagree? You might think, well, because that question doesn't really have an answer. And you might think there are some moral examples like this, right? So you might think we can find examples of perfectly rational people who've thought about all the same arguments, considered all the same evidence, but still disagree about, for instance, whether or not the war in Iraq was justified, whether or not torture is ever justified, whether or not abortion is, or when and under what circumstances abortion is justified. And if there are lots of cases like this, if there's a whole range of moral questions on which it seems like two parties can rationally disagree, then you might think, well, why is that? And you might think, well, the best explanation is that, well, there's because not really any correct answers to that question. So how convinced should we be about this? Should noticing the amount of disagreement on moral questions make us doubt that morality is objective in the sense I've suggested? Well, I think that this is a really difficult issue. So one thing that I think makes it difficult is that lots of kind of real life moral disagreements are not kind of purely moral disagreements. They're disagreements which also involve factual disagreements. So disagreement on kind of non-moral questions. So again, there are lots of examples of this. So lots of people who disagree about what we should do about climate change also disagree about what the effects of climate change will be, or disagree about what options we have in the face of climate change. Lots of people who disagree about abortion also disagree about whether or not the fetus is a person. And of course, lots of moral disagreements involve underlying disagreements about religion. So lots of people who think homosexuality is immoral think that because they think that there's a God and he's said that homosexuality is immoral. And so because these moral disagreements are kind of wrapped up with these underlying factual disagreements, it's not so clear that we're in a position to assess whether or not it really is possible to kind of to be aware of all the same arguments, all the same facts, have thought rationally about them, and yet still disagree. And what would cast doubt on the objectivity of morality, it seems to me, is if there was widespread disagreement amongst rational people who agreed on all of the underlying facts about moral questions. And I think I think it's hard to say whether or not that's right. It's hard to say whether, if these people resolved their disagreements on the underlying factual questions, they'd still disagree on the moral questions. And it seems like in some cases they wouldn't, right? So it seems like in some cases, if the person who thinks that homosexuality is immoral because they think that there's a God who says that it is, came to think, oh no, that's false, either they come to think there's no God, or they come to think that no, maybe God didn't say that homosexuality is immoral, then it seems like that person would stop, or at least insofar as they were rational, would stop thinking that homosexuality is immoral, and so there wouldn't be this disagreement. So this issue about disagreement really turns on kind of what would happen if everyone who was thought rationally about these things agreed on these underlying factual questions. It seems to me like that's a hard question to answer. How are we doing for time? Okay. So that was the first reason why you might doubt that morality is objective. So now I want to turn to the second reason that I want to discuss. So lots of people have this sense that that moral facts, if there were moral facts, they'd be kind of weird entities. They'd be kind of spooky or unscientific, or not the kind of entity which we kind of have reason to believe really exists. There's a couple of ways in which you might think that. So first of all, it seems like moral properties like rightness and wrongness aren't part of the observable kind of empirical world. So to take a kind of nice, striking example from Gilbert Harman, a Princeton philosopher. So suppose you're kind of on the street and you see a gang of youths setting fire to a cat. And presumably you think, oh God, what are they doing? That's terrible. What's going on here? You might think that, what do you really observe here? Well, you might think you can see them. You see the people, you see the cats, you see them setting fire to the cat, you see the cat kind of squealing and kind of acting as if it's in pain. You see the youths maybe kind of laughing and joking and appear to be kind of enjoying themselves, taking pleasure in this. But you might think you don't really see the wrongness, right? Where you might think the wrongness of that thing, of that action, isn't like something you can kind of observe. Nor does it seem like it's something that a scientific instrument would help you to discern. So it doesn't seem like there's any kind of microscope which you could hold against this action and it would point out, oh yeah, there's the wrongness. It also doesn't seem like properties like wrongness kind of figure in causal explanations. So you might think, in order to kind of explain what's going on in this situation, we don't need to appeal to anything like the wrongness of it. All we need to appeal to are the kind of physical, observable facts and our reactions to them. So there's this physical, observable action of the people setting fire to this cat, and there's our kind of horrified reaction at their doing this. You might think that's kind of really all there is there. There's no kind of further property of its wrongness. That would be a kind of weird, spooky property. So that's one way in which you might think moral properties like wrongness would be kind of weird properties, the kind of things which if we kind of accept the broadly scientific worldview, we don't accept. We can push this worry a bit further too. So it seems to many people that moral wrongness, if there was such a thing, would have to be kind of tightly bound up with reasons for action. So it seems to lots of people that if an action is really morally wrong, so if it's morally wrong to torture cats, then that gives everyone strong reasons not to torture cats. And what's more, it gives you those reasons kind of whatever you like. So even if what you most want to do is to torture cats, even if that's what you get most pleasure out of, you still have really good, you still shouldn't do it. You still have a good reason not to do it. That's the kind of, that seems to be kind of a quite intuitive thought about, if something's morally wrong, then you have a really good reason to do it, and you don't kind of get off the hook by saying, yeah, but I like doing that thing. But you might also think that, hang on, if we're saying that someone has a reason to do something, doesn't that have to kind of connect up in some way with what that person is like? Don't we really? Doesn't it have to connect up with their goals or motivations? Can we really make sense of someone having a good reason to do something, but even though that thing doesn't kind of help them achieve their goals or aims in any way? So this is a second way in which you might think properties like wrongness would be kind of strange. So you might think that they'd have to kind of give all of us reasons which are kind of completely independent of what we're like, and you might think, no, what we have reasons to do surely is in some way a function of what we're like, what we enjoy doing, what our goals and aims are, and so on. So that's sort of two reasons why you might think that moral properties like wrongness, would be kind of weird properties and the kinds of things that you might think don't exist. So the first was that, well, it seems like we can't kind of see them, they're not part of the observable empirical world, and the second was that they'd have to have this special connection with what we have reasons to do. What should we think about this worry? Well, again, I think this is a difficult issue. So let me kind of close by saying something about how some philosophers who accept that morality is objective would try and combat this issue. So a common strategy here is to appeal to what's sometimes called partners in guilt, or perhaps better, partners in innocence. So the thought is, so the objection to the person who believes that morality is objective is that, well, moral properties like wrongness would be these kind of weird, spooky, unscientific properties. So we can kind of make this, we can kind of get rid of this worry if we can show, no, there are other things which clearly do exist, but which share these same kind of properties, but which are which have these features which you might have thought make moral properties weird. And so this will probably be clearer if I give some examples. So there's various kind of candidates that people mention here. So one kind of candidate that people mention are mathematical truths. So it looks like numbers are not the kinds of things that we can see or observe with scientific instruments, but that presumably doesn't lead us to think that there are no such things as objective mathematical truths. I think that analogy you might think is strained in various ways. So I want to talk about a different kind of strategy, which is to think about facts about what it's rational to believe. So suppose that we acquire conclusive evidence that something is the case. Suppose, for instance, we acquire conclusive evidence that the butler committed the crime. So we find out that he was the only one who had access to the murder weapon, that maybe his DNA is all over the victim, maybe it's all caught on videotape. So we have really compelling evidence that the butler committed this crime. Seems like those facts make it rational for us to believe that the butler committed the crime. And it seems like those facts make it irrational for us to refuse to believe that. If we kind of went on proclaiming the butler's innocence, seems like we'd be irrationally ignoring the evidence. But notice that facts about what it's rational to believe, facts about what it's irrational to believe, are also not the kinds of facts which we can observe in the natural world. They're also not the kind of facts which we could reveal with using a microscope. They're not the kind of facts, you might also think they're not the kind of facts which figure in causal explanations. So facts about what it's rational to believe seem kind of analogous to moral facts in this way. And what's more, these facts about what it's rational to believe also seem to have this connection with reasons. So if it is rational to believe that the butler committed the crime, then it seems like you have an excellent reason to believe that the butler committed the crime. And what's more, it seems that you have that reason kind of whether or not, whatever your goals, whatever your interests. Even if you really want to believe that the butler is innocent, but it seems like nonetheless, given the weight of evidence, what is rational for you to do is to believe that the butler did commit the crime. And so in this way too, you might think facts about what it's rational to believe look like these moral facts. So just as we can't see the wrongness of an action, and just as you might think that the wrongness of an action gives everyone reasons not to do that action, you might think, well, we can't kind of see the rationality of believing this. And yet the rationality of believing this does give us good reasons to believe it. So where does that leave us? Well, obviously it doesn't show that morality is objective. It doesn't show that there are facts about what's right and wrong. So for one thing, you might just take that to show, well, you might kind of go along with the same train of thought we began with. I thought, I started off thinking that facts about what is wrong, facts about wrongness are weird, and so I rejected facts about wrongness. You might think, well, what you've just shown me here is I should also reject facts about what it's rational to believe, and think that what it's rational to believe is a subjective matter too. But if we're not prepared to take that step, showing that facts about what it's rational to believe are have some of these same features that moral facts do, that might begin to remove one sort of doubt that you might have about whether or not morality is objective. So that's about all I wanted to say. So hopefully I've raised some issues for discussion. So basically I've just done two things. I've argued that we tend to treat morality as if it was objective, and then I've raised two reasons why you might doubt that, and suggested a couple of ways in which someone who did think that morality is objective might respond to those things.